Hi everyone, it's Alice, and today I thought we would just have a little chat about some lovely wintry books. Winter is in full swing here right now, at least. It's really cold outside and the days are really short and it's dark. It gets dark at like 3 o'clock here right now, and it's basically the perfect time of year to be staying inside and do some reading. Funnily enough, for me, I quite like being outside in winter. I probably spend more time outside in the winter than I do in the summer, which I realize is kind of strange, but I just really like winter and I like the cold. I love going for walks in the cold. I don't know if that's just me or if it's like a Norwegian thing. Who knows, but it's lovely outside right now. I might be the only one who feels that way, but that's how I feel. The only thing we're lacking is like solid snow. We have a little bit of snow on the ground, like just a little bit, and it is snowing a little bit right now, but it's the kind of snow that's like very fluffy and there's not a lot of it and it doesn't look like it's gonna stick. But at some point, I assume we will have a lot of snow because that happens every year. Anyways, I can kind of tell that I haven't filmed in a while because I'm chit-chatting a lot. But basically what we're gonna do today is I'm gonna recommend you some of my favorite wintry books because this is the perfect time of year to read them. And then I also have a little stack of books from my TBR that I'm gonna try to get to. At least, hopefully, I'll get to some of them this winter. So for the recommendations, first of course we have The Bear and the Nightingale by Catherine Arden. This is the first book in the Winter Night trilogy, which is one of my favorite series ever, and I feel like this is as solid of a winter book as you can get. The story is set in medieval Russia in the wilderness where there's basically winter all year round, and we meet this young girl who is living with her family, and she grows up with the tradition of honoring house spirits, which she can actually see, whereas most people can't, so they are real in this story. And then sadly her mother passes away and her father leaves for Moscow to find another wife, and he brings her back, and unfortunately she's super religious and she denies anyone doing any of their like old traditions, and this has a lot of consequences. The setting of this is absolutely amazing. I love the magic and the folk tales and like the creatures that we meet because there's more than just the house spirits. There's other stuff going on as well. And it's just a very immersive and creative story, I feel. And I don't think you can get a more wintry book than this. I can also recommend the second book in the series, but I haven't read the third one yet. I'm kind of like saving it, although I should probably try to read it while it's winter. Secondly, we have got another historical fiction novel. It's Burial Rites by Hannah Kent, which is set in Iceland, and it's based on the true story of a woman who was accused of a murder there in 1829. Obviously, the setting of Iceland is amazing, and in this story we meet this kind of mysterious woman at first who is sent to live on this isolated farm with this family, and she basically stays there while she's awaiting her fate. And the family is not super keen to have her there because they think that she's a murderer. And throughout the story, we basically, like, when they talk to each other and get to know each other, we basically find out what actually happened. It's been a while since I read this and I really should reread it, but I distinctly remember the feeling that this book gave me. I remember the atmosphere was just amazing, and for some reason when I was reading this book I just couldn't get enough of it. There's like a quiet quality to this book which I feel is quite rare. There's like a stillness to it that I just absolutely loved, and I just remember the book just sucked me in. Then I've got a recommendation that, I mean, you can read this any time of year really. You can read whatever you want at any time, but this has like all seasons in it, but there is something distinctly wintry about it, to me at least. I feel like it's extra special to read when it's winter. It's Anna Karenina by Leo Tolstoy, which obviously winter in Russia is like something else, and a lot of this takes place during it. I'm not going to talk too much about this because it's a classic and most people are familiar with this book, but basically in here we meet this woman who falls passionately in love with someone who is not her husband, and we see a lot about that, but then there are also a couple of other storylines going on, and there's basically just a lot of stuff in this book. This is easily one of my favorite classics. The writing in here is just, oh, it's so good. And I especially love the way that everything is described, especially the different settings, and I just love it so much. It's like peak literature to me. And I feel like this story has a kind of like heaviness to it and bleakness to it that fits with the season very well. Then I'm gonna throw a little bit of a dystopian book into the mix because we gotta have one of those. It's The Book of the Unnamed Midwife by Meg Ellison, and this is, in my opinion, a really, really underrated dystopian novel, and I never hear anyone really talk about this book. And it's so good. The story is set in a world where a fever has decimated most of the Earth's population. And for some reason, this fever killed more women and children than anyone else. So there's a lot more men left than women, and there are basically no children. And we meet this woman who is a midwife, and she knows that she might be the last midwife left on Earth. Now, when I say the last one, you might think that that's unlikely, but like in this world, there really are not a lot of people left. I feel like in some post-apocalyptic or dystopian stories, you don't get a good sense of how few people there are left, but in here, there really are not a lot of people. And she, like our main character, can go months without seeing anyone. And there's also, like, there's one scene in this book that really stuck with me, which is our main character comes into contact with this couple, and when she leaves them, she, like, I don't remember how we know this, but we learn that these people, like this couple, live the rest of their lives without seeing a single other human being. So, like, it's very, very bleak. It's such a good book though, and if you like stories like The Handmaid's Tale, this is the perfect book for you. It discusses a lot of interesting things, and it's just really dark and gritty, and this book does not play around. Next, we have got another classic. It's The Mistletoe Murder and Other Stories by P.D. James, and if you like authors like Agatha Christie, this is perfect. The collection contains 4 short stories, and I remember when I read this, I was really impressed by what the author was able to do in such a short format. I think setting up like mysteries is quite the feat, and sometimes I read like 300-page books that don't do it like super well, but somehow this author manages to do it in like 100 pages or less, which I think is really impressive. I think these stories are really good. It's like cozy and charming, and it has that like golden age of mystery fiction vibe to it. Then, of course, I have to mention what might be my most wintry book that I own. It's Winter Tales by Casey Dawn, and this is illustrated by Sanna Goldhawk. And this basically contains all of these stories celebrating winter from all over the world. These kinds of books are just a treat, I think. It's beautifully illustrated, and like every time you flip the page, there is something for you to look at, which I think is really lovely. I love reading folk tales from around the world, and I really like the artwork in this. And I read this as an adult, and I really, really enjoyed it. But I also think if you have any kids in your life, reading this with them is just, it just sounds so lovely. I've also got a couple of Norwegian books to recommend for you that are just perfect for this season. And the first one has the most beautiful wintry title. It's The Ice Palace by Tarjei Vesaas, and this is a classic, and it's basically considered this author's masterpiece. The book is set in a small rural community in Norway, and we basically meet these 2 friends who have this connection even though they've only known each other for like 1 evening, and something happens between them as they're sort of getting to know each other that makes one of them skip school the next day, and she decides to, instead of going to school, she's gonna go visit the Ice Palace, which is close to this community, and it's basically a waterfall that is frozen over, and so it sort of looks like an ice palace, and she goes into this and disappears. There is a lot more going on in this story, and it has a lot in it for such a short book. And there is also like a magical or surreal element to it, because this girl can go into the waterfall and there's like something inside of it, and there's like rooms and stuff. It's kind of hard to explain, but it's really, really good. And It's just a story of friendship and grief and loneliness, and it does have a frozen waterfall slash ice castle, which is pretty cool. The second Norwegian book that I have is a crime novel, and it happens to be one of my favorite ones that I've ever read. It's The Snowman by Jul Nesbø, and this is a book in a series. I think it's the 7th book in a series, actually, but I stand by the fact that you can read these without, like, you can read them out of order and you don't need to have read any of the other books to read this book. I don't love all of the other books in the series, so I don't really want to recommend those. If anything, you can like read up on the main character a little bit before you read this, but I'm pretty sure I read this and I'd only read one other book before and it was fine. It's set in Oslo, which you might know is where I live. It's set in November and we meet this detective who we follow throughout the series, and he gets this case of the disappearance of the mother of this boy, and she disappeared in the middle of the night and there are like no traces left after her, except in the backyard of this house there is a snowman that wasn't there the day before, and the snowman is like wearing the mother's scarf, and no one really knows how any of that got there. Now obviously it could just be a random snowman because it's Norway and people build snowmen all the time, but this detective thinks it's weird, and even though other people dismiss it, he just finds it suspicious. And because of that, he sort of starts seeing connections to other cases, and he just gets pulled into this like thing with a serial killer, and it's like a whole game, and it's really twisted, and it's just so good. I remember when I got to the end of this book, I don't remember what happens in most of it, but I still remember what happens at the very end, which is very rare for me. Like, I forget things the minute I close the book and I have no idea what I just read. But I remember the final scene of this book and I was so taken aback and so shocked, and I just thought the ending was so good. Lastly, for the recommendations before we move on to my little TBR pile, I have got a nonfiction book, which is again one of my favorites. It's Into Thin Air by Jon Krakauer, and it basically tells the story of the author who joined the climb of the highest mountain in the world in 1996, which happened to be a disaster year for like climbing that mountain, and it was like one of the deadliest seasons that's ever been on Everest. You do not at all need an interest in mountain climbing or like extreme sports to enjoy this book, because it really is mostly about humans pushing themselves to the limit and pushing themselves into doing these extreme things and the consequences that that can have. Some of those consequences are natural, some of it can be human error, and delving into it is just fascinating. There is something magical to mountains though, I think, and there is something magical to like climbing the highest mountain in the world. So there is a lot of wonder in this book, but there's also a lot of darkness and a lot of pain. So much pain. And I really liked that. I felt like it was very realistic, and it was so realistic sometimes that when I was reading this book, there were parts where I almost felt like I couldn't breathe because the author couldn't breathe. And this is a first-hand account, and you really get into like how this was like for him and what doing things like this is like, and it's just so good. Alright, so we're gonna move on to my TBR pile. So all of these are books that I have on my shelves that are just waiting for me to read them, and they're all wintry as far as I'm aware of. And first up we have The Sanatorium by Sarah Pearse, and I've actually had this book for a while. I've had it for maybe like 2 years or something, but there's just something about it that makes me feel like I have to read it when it's winter because the setting is so wintry. We follow a detective in here who goes to this like isolated getaway to celebrate her brother's engagement, I think, and they used to be estranged, and she doesn't really want to be there, but she feels like she has to. And this hotel that she's at is like a 5-star hotel, but it used to be a sanatorium, and she gets a really weird vibe being in this place. And then, of course, there's like a snowstorm. They get like caught in it and can't get out, and then I think someone either dies or disappears. I love a locked room mystery, especially with this kind of setting, so I really want to read this. I am aware it has gotten quite mixed reviews, and so I don't have super high hopes for this. I just want, like, sometimes what you want out of a book is just like atmosphere, a cool setting, and a little bit of escapism, and that's what I'm hoping this will be. Secondly, we have The Shining by Stephen King, which is the classic horror novel that I've yet to read. And again, it's set at a hotel, except this is kind of old and a little rundown, I think. And we meet a man who brings his family there to be like the off-season caretaker. So I guess the hotel is closed, basically. And he goes there because he thinks it's a good opportunity to reconnect with his family and focus on his writing. But if you've ever heard about the story, you might know that a lot of weird stuff starts happening. I have seen the movie for this, I think. I'm pretty sure. But I may not have actually watched it because whenever I do, like on the rare occasion that I do watch a horror movie, I like sit like this behind a pillow. So I don't know how much of it I actually saw back when I saw it. And I don't know how much I've just picked up from it being a really famous movie. But I have like vague memories of what the story is, but I don't really know. And I think reading it could be very interesting. And I'd love it if this, like, the setting is kind of wintry. I am worried that this is gonna freak me out though. Then we've got what sounds basically like the first book that I mentioned in this TBR. It's The Hunting Party by Lucy Foley, which again is about someone who gets stuck because of a storm. It's another mystery novel, and we follow this group of friends who used to go to college together at Oxford, and they come together to, I think they want to celebrate New Year's together, and they go to this old hunting lodge in Scotland, and they get stuck because there's a blizzard. And I think they only spend like 2 days there, but by the time those 2 days have passed, a person has died and no one really knows who did it or what happened. I've heard this is a really good psychological suspense novel, and it's apparently very atmospheric. And I do love anything that's like set in the Scottish wilderness, so I think this is gonna be good. Second to last, we have To the Lake by Jana Wagner, and this is like either dystopian or post-apocalyptic, I don't really know, but the cover is very wintry. It's set in Siberia for the most part, I think. I think what happens is that some sort of flu epidemic hits Moscow and this couple escape. And I don't know why they go to Siberia. I think they have like a cabin there or something, and they have to deal with staying there during a very harsh winter, and they have dwindling supplies. And then I think somehow, like, the man of the couple takes in this stranger, and that causes a lot of friction within the relationship because the woman doesn't want to. And also there's like something weird about this person. I love a good isolated setting, and I think this has some dystopian vibes. I don't know how much of that we're gonna see, but I think that will be interesting to find out. Then at the very, very end, we have The Honjin Murders by Saishi Yokomizo, and this is a Japanese classic that I'm pretty sure I've mentioned several times by now, and I still really want to read it. The story is set in 1937 in this little village in wintertime, and basically in this village everyone is really excited because there's a huge wedding on. I think the son of a really wealthy family is getting married, and so everyone is really excited, and that's great. But the night before the wedding, unfortunately, there's more than excitement going on. There's like a masked stranger wandering about asking weird questions, and there's eerie music and a scream, and then all they find is like a samurai sword thrust into the snow. And that's all they have to go on, really. I don't know if someone dies or if someone disappears or what it is, but there is a mystery to be solved. Okay, everyone. Those are all the books that I had to show you today. Now, I would love to know what your favorite wintry book is. If you have several, tell me all about all of them. And also, if you have a wintry book on your TBR that you're really excited about, I would love to hear about it. As always, thank you very much for hanging out with me today, and I will see you soon. Bye!